The call came at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, and I almost didn't answer. I was sitting on the floor of my apartment in Portland, surrounded by grant applications I'd been staring at for 3 hours without reading a single word. My phone lit up with a number I still had saved under Dad's house, even though my father had been dead for 8 months. It was my aunt calling from his landline. That detail alone should have told me something. She said my grandmother had fallen. Hip fracture. Maybe worse. The hospital wanted family present for the surgical consent forms because my grandmother, Nana Ruth, 81 years old, and sharp as a blade until about 6 months ago, had been showing signs of cognitive decline. Someone needed to come. Someone needed to sign. I was the only someone she called. I should have asked more questions. I should have called the hospital directly, verified the situation, checked who else had been notified. Instead, I booked a red-eye to Columbus and packed a bag in 20 minutes, because that's what you do when the last person in your family who ever truly loved you might be dying in a hospital bed alone. My name is Claire. I'm 32 years old, and I work as a grant writer for a nonprofit that builds community gardens in underserved neighborhoods. It is not glamorous work. It pays modestly, it requires patience, and it demands the ability to make a compelling case out of incomplete information. I'm good at it because I grew up learning to read between lines to find the story hiding underneath the one being told out loud. My father raised me alone after my mother left when I was 4. He was a quiet man, an electrician, careful with money and careful with words. We weren't close in the way people describe closeness. We didn't talk every day or share much about our feelings, but there was something solid between us, something reliable. He showed up to things. He remembered what mattered to me. When he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 2 years ago, I took 3 weeks off work and drove to Columbus to sit with him through the first round of treatment. He told me not to come. I came anyway. He died in February, on a morning that was too bright for what it was. His sister, my Aunt Patricia, handled the arrangements. She lived 20 minutes from him and had positioned herself as the practical one, the capable one, the one who knew where things were kept. I was the daughter who lived far away. That distinction mattered more than I understood at the time. My grandmother, Ruth, was my father's mother. She was the reason I'd ever felt connected to that family at all. She used to mail me things, newspaper clippings, recipes, photographs with dates written on the back in her particular curling script. When I visited as a child, she'd sit me at her kitchen table and tell me things about my father that he would never have told me himself. She saw me in a way that his family rarely did. She said once, squeezing my hand across the table, that I had his best qualities and none of his stubbornness, and that someday I'd understand that was the greatest inheritance she could give me. After my father died, I called her every Sunday. Her voice had changed in recent months, slower, occasionally confused about time, but she still knew me. She still asked about the garden projects. She still said my name, the way she always had, like it meant something. The hospital room smelled like recycled air and antiseptic. Nana Ruth was smaller in the bed than I expected, one leg immobilized, eyes half open. She recognized me. That was the first relief. Patricia was already there when I arrived, sitting in the corner chair with her reading glasses on and a yellow legal pad across her knees. Her daughter, my cousin Melissa, stood by the window. Neither of them looked surprised to see me. Neither of them looked particularly glad either. The doctor came and went. The fracture was significant, but the surgery was routine. Recovery would take time. There was a discussion about care arrangements afterward, whether Nana Ruth could return to her house or would need a facility, and Patricia did most of the talking. She spoke with the authority of someone who had already decided. I asked questions. She answered them in a way that technically included information while actually communicating very little. That night, Patricia offered me the guest room at her house. I said I'd prefer to stay near the hospital. She nodded like this was what she expected. On the second day, while my grandmother slept and Patricia had gone to handle something she didn't specify, a nurse I hadn't seen before stopped in the doorway of Nana Ruth's room. She had a kind face and the practiced efficiency of someone who had worked long shifts for many years. She hesitated. Then she asked, quietly, whether I was the granddaughter from Oregon. "Portland," I said. "Yes." She glanced down the hallway in both directions. She told me that she wasn't supposed to share specifics, but that someone had been in the day before asking about my grandmother's cognitive assessment. asking specifically about the documentation, about whether the results had been filed, about the timeline for the evaluation. I asked who had been asking. She said she couldn't say. Then she said, just audibly, that the person had not been a doctor. She moved on before I could ask anything else. I sat back down in the chair beside my grandmother's bed and looked at the legal pad Patricia had left on the windowsill. It was turned face down. I didn't touch it, but I thought about it for the next 4 hours. On the third day, my grandmother was more alert. We talked for almost an hour slowly, with pauses, but clearly. She asked about Portland. She asked about the gardens. Then she reached over and gripped my wrist with more strength than I expected, and she said something that I keep returning to, even now. She said, "Your father tried to tell me something a few weeks before he died. About the house." She paused. I told him I already knew. I should have listened to what he actually meant. I asked her what she meant. She drifted before she could answer, eyes closing, grip loosening. I wrote down her exact words in my phone before I forgot them. That afternoon, Patricia called me to the house for what she described as a family conversation. Melissa was there. A man I didn't recognize was introduced as a family friend and financial advisor. He had a soft handshake and a folder of documents. The conversation was structured carefully. Patricia began with concern for Nana Ruth's well-being, for her safety, for the burden of managing her affairs as her cognition declined. Everything was framed in the language of love and practicality. Then the folder opened. There was paperwork. A petition, already drafted, to establish a conservatorship over my grandmother's estate and personal decisions. Patricia would serve as conservator. The financial advisor had prepared a management plan. The documents were thorough. Someone had been working on this for a while. And then Patricia slid a second set of papers across the table toward me. She said they were related to my father's estate. She said there had been an issue that prior to his death, my father had borrowed against a joint account he held with my grandmother, and that the amount was substantial, and that as his heir, I was being notified of the outstanding balance, which would need to be resolved before my grandmother's estate could be settled cleanly. The number on the page was $47,000. I looked at it. I looked at Patricia. I said I had never heard of this account. She said my father had managed it quietly and that this wasn't unusual, and that she was sure it was simply something he hadn't gotten around to discussing with me. I said I would need to see the original account documentation. She said that could be arranged. I said I'd like a copy of everything in the folder. She hesitated for exactly 2 seconds. Then she handed it over. I drove back to my hotel and sat on the edge of the bed and read every page 3 times. The account documents were their statements, transfer records, a signature on a withdrawal authorization. I looked at the signature for a long time. My father had signed his name the same way my entire life, a particular loop on the C, a specific way the last letter trailed off. I had watched him sign things 100 times, birthday cards, school forms, the deed for his house. That signature was not his. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the small desk in the hotel room with my laptop open, pulling together everything I could find. I called my father's bank at 8 the next morning when they opened. I explained that I was the estate executor, which I was, named in his will, and that I needed to verify account activity. The representative I spoke with was helpful in the specific way that trained professionals are helpful, careful, bounded, but not unkind. There was no joint account with my grandmother on record. There never had been. I asked if any accounts had been opened or modified in the 18 months before my father's death. There was a pause. Then she said she would need to connect me with their fraud department. I wrote down the name of the person she transferred me to. I wrote down everything. By noon, I had called 3 people: the fraud investigator at the bank, a probate attorney whose name I found through the Oregon State Bar referral line, and my grandmother's doctor, whose direct number I had saved from a previous conversation about her care. The doctor couldn't share specifics but confirmed that a cognitive evaluation had been conducted, and that the results were part of my grandmother's official medical record results that, as a close family member, I had a right to request formally. I requested them formally. The attorney, whose name was David Park, had a calm and methodical voice. I walked him through everything: the conservatorship petition, the account documents, the signature I didn't recognize, the timeline. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, If what you're describing is accurate, this isn't a family disagreement. This is financial elder abuse. And if those documents were fabricated, it's also fraud. He asked if I could be in Columbus for the next few days. I called my supervisor and took emergency leave. She didn't ask for details. She said, take the time you need. The next morning, David met me at the hospital. He had requested a copy of my grandmother's cognitive evaluation through proper legal channels, and it had arrived. He showed me the summary. The evaluation had found mild, short-term memory impairment consistent with early-stage age-related decline. It had explicitly noted that my grandmother retained the capacity to understand and communicate her own preferences and decisions. Patricia's conservatorship petition had characterized the evaluation as indicating significant cognitive impairment requiring immediate intervention. That was not what the evaluation said, not even close. I went back to my grandmother's room and sat with her that afternoon. I didn't tell her everything. I told her that I was looking into some paperwork questions and that she didn't need to worry. She looked at me with the same clear eyes she'd always had and said, "You sound like your father when he finally decided something." I asked her, as carefully as I could, whether she had ever signed anything related to a joint account with my father. She thought about it with a particular concentration of someone navigating around fog. Then she said, "No. Your father asked me once about setting something up, and I said I preferred to keep things simple. He said that was fine." She paused. He never asked again. I squeezed her hand. I said, "I know. I found the USB drive by accident. When my father died, I had packed up the contents of his desk myself. 3 cardboard boxes that I'd shipped back to Portland, telling myself I'd go through them properly when I was ready. I hadn't been ready. They were still stacked in my closet. But I had taken one small item with me when I left Columbus the first time, a tin I'd found in the back of his desk drawer, the kind that used to hold throat lozenges. I'd assumed it was sentimental. I'd tucked it into my carry-on without opening it. It was still in the inner pocket of the bag I'd grabbed for this trip. The USB drive inside was small and unlabeled. I plugged it into my laptop with hands that were steadier than I expected. There were 11 files. Most were scanned documents, account statements, a copy of his original will with handwritten margin notes, medical records I didn't look at. But the last file was a voice memo. He had recorded it on his phone and transferred it to the drive. The timestamp was 6 weeks before he died. His voice was tired. The treatments had taken a lot from him by then. But the words were exact. He said he had become aware that Patricia had been accessing financial information in his name without his knowledge. He said he had confronted her, and she had denied it. He said he was concerned that after he was gone, she would move to consolidate control over their mother's affairs, and that she would use his name, his accounts, his signature, his relationship with Nana Ruth as leverage to do it. He said he didn't have proof yet, only suspicion, but that he wanted a record of his suspicion in case it turned out to matter. He said he had meant to tell me all of this in person, and that he kept putting it off because it was difficult to say. He said he was sorry he hadn't been better at saying the difficult things. I sat in that hotel room and listened to my father's voice for 22 minutes, and then I called David Park. He answered on the second ring. I told him what I had. He said, "Can you be at my office at 8 tomorrow morning?" I said yes. What followed was not fast. I want to be honest about that, because the stories we tell about justice often compress the hardest parts. There were days of documentation. There were calls that went unreturned and processes that moved at the pace of institutional wheels grinding slowly forward. There was a morning when the fraud investigator at the bank called to say that the account in question had been opened 18 months prior, using my father's identification that had been used without his knowledge or consent. There was the afternoon David called to tell me the court had agreed to delay the conservatorship hearing pending investigation. There was the moment Patricia called me, and I let it go to voicemail, and listened to her voice saying she thought there had been a misunderstanding, that she hoped we could talk, that family was what mattered most in times like this. I saved the voicemail. David said it might be useful. The hearing was rescheduled twice. By the time we stood in front of a probate judge in a wood-paneled courtroom, 3 months had passed. I had driven back to Columbus twice more. David had filed enough motions that I'd lost track of the numbers. The bank's fraud department had completed their investigation and submitted findings. A forensic document examiner had reviewed the forged signature and provided a written opinion. My grandmother was present in the courtroom in a wheelchair, which she'd agreed to only under protest. She was wearing her good blue coat. She had done her hair. Patricia's attorney presented the conservatorship case with the confidence of someone who hadn't yet realized the ground had shifted. He spoke about care, about family responsibility, about the complexity of managing an elderly parent's affairs. Then David stood up. He entered the bank's findings into evidence. He entered the forensic examiner's report. He played 11 seconds of my father's voice, recording enough to establish its existence and content, which he then submitted in full. He entered the cognitive evaluation, with the actual text highlighted next to Patricia's characterization of it. He asked the court to note the discrepancy. The judge noted it. When I was asked to speak, I answered every question directly. I described my grandmother's clarity of mind in the conversations I'd had with her. I described the signature. I described finding the USB drive. I did not raise my voice. I had spent enough of my life managing other people's discomfort with directness that I'd learned it was its own kind of power. Nana Ruth was asked 2 questions by the judge directly. She answered both without hesitation. Her voice was quieter than it used to be, but her meaning was precise. The judge dismissed the conservatorship petition. He ordered that the forged account documents be referred to the district attorney's office. He made a notation in the record about the mischaracterization of the cognitive evaluation. Patricia did not speak after the ruling. She gathered her things and walked out ahead of her attorney. Melissa followed without looking up. In the hallway, my grandmother took my arm and we walked slowly toward the elevator. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Your father would have done this if he could have." I said I knew. She said, "You did it better." We went to lunch afterward, Nana Ruth and David and I, at a diner near the courthouse that she'd been going to since before I was born. She had soup and crackers and told a long story about my father as a teenager that I had never heard before, and I laughed at the parts that were supposed to be funny and didn't rush any of it. The criminal process moved on its own timeline after that. The district attorney's office took several more months. In the end, Patricia pleaded guilty to 2 counts of financial fraud. The account she had opened in my father's name was closed, and the funds that had been moved through it were traced and documented. There was no $47,000 that I owed. There had never been. Melissa called me once, about 6 weeks after the hearing. She said she hadn't known the full extent of what her mother was doing. I believe that was partly true. I said what I needed to say, which was not much, and I wished her well, and I meant it in the way you mean something that you're done carrying. My grandmother is still in her house. She has a home health aide 3 days a week now, a woman named Darlene who she has described to me as extremely bossy and excellent company. I call on Sundays. Her voice is the same. I went back to Portland in the spring. The grant applications were still there, waiting with the particular patience of paperwork. I finished them. 2 came through. We broke ground on a new garden site in May. I think about my father's voice on that recording sometimes, the tiredness in it, and the care and the apology for things left unsaid. I understand that apology differently now than I would have before. Silence isn't always avoidance. Sometimes it's a protection that outlives its usefulness, that becomes its own kind of harm. He saw what was coming and didn't know how to name it in time. I named it. That was enough. If someone in your family has made you feel like the difficult one, the suspicious one, the one who asks too many questions, pay attention to that feeling. Not because families are always adversarial, but because the people who benefit from your silence will always have a story ready about why your questions are the problem. The documents don't lie. Find them. Read them. And if something doesn't add up, keep pulling the thread. If this story meant something to you, leave a comment below. Subscribe so you're here for the next one, where the truth, as always, refuses to stay buried.